Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you had a great lunch, had a chance to explore and walk around, see what some of the various folks are doing in the curb space. I'm Alex Mitchell. I am not your CNN moderator. I'm from a different media outlet, the Sustainability Newsletter. Also work at Lacey, which is one of the companies that incubated and invested in ChargerHelp. We'll get to that in a moment. But what we're talking about in this session is really what are the new and emerging models that make all of this activity that we're all very excited about more sustainable. So we'll sort of touch into some of the really more interesting aspects of how we make all this movement of people and goods at the curb sustainable. I am blessed to be joined by a few folks that I'll quickly introduce. Kameale Terry of ChargerHelp, Tiya Gordon of Itselectric, Paul Vitrano of Waev, and Ed Walker of Hub International. The four of them will each introduce a little bit about their business, but I'm going to start this panel with sort of a provocative question for each of them. So, you'll each get a chance to explain your business by way of answering the provocative question of the day. So, if the topic is really about the movement of people and goods, especially as it relates to the curb, I want to start with one of my favorite vehicles that's an interesting addition to our EV landscape, which is the GM EV Hummer. You might have seen it at the Super Bowl ad from a couple years ago. Was a very big splash by General Motors to announce, like, hey, the biggest, largest vehicle you can imagine is now an electric vehicle. And I want to pass a question to you, Paul, about, like, okay, here we are. Like, the electric age is upon us in terms of mobility. Let's just replace all these gasoline-powered Honda CR-Vs and whatever else out here in the parking lot. Let's just replace them with EV Hummers, and we're good to go. We've solved our mobility problems, right? Like, isn't that just the answer? Is replace all these cars with an EV Hummer, and we're good to go?
No, not for a variety of reasons, Alex. First and foremost, those vehicles are not accessible to most of the population. And that's a real challenge as we try to move transportation and mobility to electrification, is it needs to be accessible to people from all walks of life. In addition, there are costs associated with vehicles of that type. The resource drain to make those vehicles, the resources that go into operating them and keeping them are really more than we could sustain as a society on a widespread basis. In addition, there are safety considerations with all types of electric vehicles, but particularly the larger ones have massive weight, and that creates safety issues for other road users and dangers associated with any malfunctions that go along with that much mass and that much electricity there. So really, for us to achieve a multitude of goals, we need mode shift. We need different form factors for every use case so that you're using just what you need and not too much more. And that's why we've seen over the years, with the rise of micromobility, there's now a continuum of different form factors depending on what you need. Our vehicle, I'm one of the co-founders of Waev, which acquired and is carrying forward the GEM line of low-speed vehicles. Street legal motor vehicles can go 25 miles per hour on roads 35 miles per hour and slower. I live in Washington, D.C. I take my GEM everywhere I need to go. My SUV sits in the garage because I don't need any more. And I think there's going to be more and more people that choose vehicle types that are suited to their needs.
Cool. Okay. Thank you very much. Kameale at ChargerHelp, I want to ask you a question. In the news a couple weeks ago was the announcement that Tesla had gotten access to federal funding by making their supercharger network open to non-Tesla drivers. This was a pretty big deal because if you talk to people who are EV drivers, right, a lot of them will almost compare it to being part of the either Apple ecosystem or the Android ecosystem. Maybe, the Apple system is a more tightly controlled ecosystem, a little bit more premium than the Android one. And Tesla's now basically on the cusp of saying we have an EV charging experience that a lot of consumers will tweet about and say is better than the experience you have at the charging when you go to a charge point, EVgo, et cetera. And so you might have this situation where there's now, throngs of people who are, previously in the Android-like ecosystem, EV Connect, EVgo, et cetera, saying, ooh, I want to be part of the Tesla supercharger network and have access to that premium charging experience. I'd love you to explain like sort of what's working and what's not in the charging experience, both, in the Tesla ecosystem and the other ecosystem, and like what role ChargerHelp plays in that whole experience.
Thanks, Alex. Well, for folks who don't know, at ChargerHelp, we fix charging stations when they break. And so one of the things I always like to do is to take a step back. Like, the whole point of all of this is for us to have cleaner and greener air, whether that means you're driving an electric vehicle or using a micromobility. Like, there's a larger thing here at play. And so if that is what we're trying to push for, right, for folks to just enjoy their experience, I think that it shouldn't matter whether, you choose a Tesla or whatever have you, and that all of the ecosystem should be open to other folks utilizing their charging infrastructure. What I will say is, as we've been exploring just like uptime and reliability, there is something from having a closed network. There is an opportunity to get data from cars when they're having issues with the charging station a lot faster. And we don't necessarily see that with an open network. So I more so am interested to see how Tesla will deal with that, because now their network is no longer closed and there are new issues that are going to come about. But the way that we think about it at ChargerHelp is that if our goal is to ensure that people have a good experience from driving or choosing electricity or any other micromobility, we just have to be helpful in all parts and be more collaborative, and that it shouldn't be one against the other, but that we should all be trying to push forward with just a better experience.
Cool. All right. Well, speaking of the charging experience, Tiya, I want to punt your first question to you on the topic of, I'm looking over a parking lot. I don't see any chargers in this parking lot, but the historical plan to getting that charging infrastructure in non-residential applications has just been like, okay, we'll find some parking lots where we can put public level 2 chargers in, and then we've solved the issue. Every American will have access to EV chargers, which means they'll adopt electric vehicles, and we're good to go. Can you sort of give us a counter argument, and why is that not that one size fits all to just charging infrastructure gonna cut it if we're gonna meet some of our adoption goals on EVs?
Got it. So I'm going to start by putting myself out there and answering the question by saying, is Brooklyn in the house at all over here? All right, I got one person. Everybody else likely doesn't park on street as I do in Brooklyn, New York. So what we're here to do is to provide solutions for people to be able to charge where they're already parking. Destination parking, meaning I'm going to a parking lot on the weekend. I have to go to a Trader Joe's, I have to go to a Walmart, I have to go to a Whole Foods. That for me is stopgap. It's very easy for charging companies to come in and to bring a backhoe into a parking lot and drop in 5 chargers. It's a lot harder to put in chargers on curbside so people can charge where they already park at night. So right now, we're using what we have. We're doing destination charging, but it's a pain in the ass to have to work a full-time job, take care of your kids, do your laundry, and then figure out how to sit in a Walmart parking lot for 5 hours on a Saturday. So it's going to work for now, but we need ubiquitous charging in communities, regardless of the prevalence of driveways, garages, and regardless of median income, to be able to move forward.
Cool. Okay. Ed, I want to talk, sort of come back to something Paul was just mentioning. We were talking about the EV Hummer and how it is perhaps not the best solution to all of our mobility challenges to just electrify a, whatever it is, 7,000, 8,000 pound vehicle. And what Paul was mentioning is, hey, like, smaller is beautiful. There's some real benefits to that. I learned something from you recently that I want you to share a little bit more about, which is some of the countervailing reasons why sometimes there's challenges to going smaller. And I learned from you that, insurance for 15, say, scooters might be more expensive than the same amount of insurance for 15 like passenger cars, which surprises me because we always think smaller is beautiful, great, more efficient, more effective, more sustainable. But maybe could you walk through why that situation on the insurance front between vehicles and micromobility might be quite different?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. And so Edward Walker, Hub International. I'm the leader of our shared economy and new mobility practice group. And we look at a lot of these various models. And when you look at a fleet, one thing I do want to clarify about that is if we have 1,000 scooters and 1,000 vehicles, the extra 15 vehicles are not going to come in at a higher price point than the extra 15 scooters above 1,000. What we're talking about here is between 0 and 15. And so when you have an industry like micromobility, and especially in cities like Santa Monica and San Francisco, where the municipal requirements are just ever growing, ever increasing, really putting a lot of pressure on these businesses to purchase $10, $15 million of insurance for a modality of transportation that there isn't much data behind. When you talk about any circle of insurance, you have to understand that these companies need to make money on the risk in order to stay around. This space right now exists of many companies that have come and gone because they've lost their money, they've gone bankrupt, and they can no longer provide a solution to the space. So getting around to your question, car sharing has been around for longer than micromobility has. We have a little bit more data, and by little bit, it's, we've probably got 3 to 4 more years more data. But when it comes to micromobility, we have 5-ish or so years of data, which in a normal insurance circumstance is the right amount of data. The status quo in corporate world for insurance is if we have 5 years, we can make predictive results out of that. However, we have 5 years of micromobility without the right infrastructure. The number one accident I see out of my group is accidents on the sidewalk. Why are people going on the sidewalk? They're not doing that because they feel like the need to knock somebody over. They're doing it because they feel threatened to go onto the streets of Los Angeles and go in the middle of the street in traffic and sit there with a scooter or e-bike while cars whiz by. I don't know about any of y'all, but sometimes I feel a little nervous in my car in LA traffic, let alone an e-bike or scooter. So the data set we have to analyze that data is very jaded. We don't have the actual statistics with the right infrastructure in place. So getting around to your question, we have a little bit more of a regimented structure when it comes to automobiles that we can lean on more antiquated models to answer those questions about true loss history versus scooters that really haven't had a adequate control group to date. So what you see is the insurance world really having a struggle to price this, and then municipal bodies across the country really imposing higher and higher, environmental, ramifications, limits of insurance, reporting data requirements, all sorts of, constraints on these businesses that really are putting a lot of the smaller fleets out of business. So ultimately making that smaller 15, 30, 50 vehicle scooter fleet almost an impossible business to manage.
Cool. Thank you for that. I want to, for all 4 of you, I want to touch on 2 big themes. One of which is what's happening in DC right now, or the after effects of these amazing 3 bills that have been passed over the last year and a half or so, and then also what cities can do to really help make this transition happen. But I want to start with the federal level. We've had landmark legislation that impacts a lot of our work. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, the CHIPS Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, all of which aim to really both jumpstart our transition to vehicle electrification and sustainability, but do it in a way that brings all communities along, not just specific communities. So I'd love for each of you to just talk through, as you're tracking the implementation of the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, et cetera, what are the topics where you say, hey, as we get into implementation, just keep an eye on this. This has a big impact on whether we succeed or not. Because, as often happens, in some of those cases, we've got the money now, it's flowing through the DOE, the DOT, but the how we do it is sometimes just as important as like how much money we were actually able to generate for that program. So maybe Kameale, can you start on just like what's, as it relates to your particular business, what's the so what of what's happening from those 3 bills that you're like, keep an eye on this?
Yeah, so prior to starting ChargerHelp, I used to work for a software company that deployed EV charging stations, and that was almost 8 or 9 years ago. And when I was at that company, there was not a lot of funding in this space. And the folks who were running those companies were like diehard environmentalists that wanted to like save the world. And, we took a lot of time to take care of like how we were doing things. One of my greatest fears with this new inflection of funding is that a lot of these things now turn into business opportunities. And what we see with business opportunities is that quality assurance is not always at the forefront. Oftentimes is what people can get away with in order for them to be able to execute or receive the check at the end. And so one of the things that I've been, really wanting to just bring forth with the industry is that we really only get one chance here, right? If we squander, billions and billions of dollars, it would be a very hard sell to get another inflection of capital. And so I like to, tell the industry that, EV charging specifically is not new, right? Like a lot of these companies have been doing this for the last 10 years, and there is a lot of learning. There is a lot of data. There is opportunity for us not to make the same mistakes. And I'm super interested in like, how do we learn from, the past projects that we've done before so that way we don't make those mistakes. And then most importantly, is there some type of balance? And yes, this is a great business opportunity, but where do we collaborate, right? Can every data set be IP? Like, where do we put forth this like greater good, in spite of trying to make a dollar? Can we? I guess that's more so the question, can we? Because there is so much money at play. And as a venture-backed company, right, like I have to make money off of this business. I guess like that gray area, I think that's something that I'm always just like wanting to highlight, not to say that I have an answer, but just to say like, hey, this is a thing. And like, we should be talking about that part more.
Cool. Tiya, what about from your perspective?
So from IRA to NEVI, there's this big $7.5 billion allotment, and $5 billion of that is going to DCFC fast charging, highway, regional solutions. And then there's the discretionary fund, which is the $2.5 billion that's for rural, urban, and that affects my area, which is curbside. But headline to all of that, which was very clear when they released the guidelines a week ago, maybe, or 2 weeks ago, is the Buy America, Build America provision, right? And so, we've all been hearing, Build America for forever. And I always laugh because in going back to New York City for a second, every year, except for this year, when there's snowfall and everyone brings their sleds to the park, there's always this giant pile of broken plastic sleds that are left at the bottom of Prospect Park Hill that all have like the Built in America sticker on them. They're just like these break after a second. And this is not a non sequitur. This is an idea that, we have this opportunity to really build in economic impact in the United States for clean energy. And so can we find ways to build true infrastructure that is lasting and that has value? From conversations I've had with Kameale about like, what are the most common parts that break on chargers, and how do we put in ideas and energy to make sure that we are actually building better when we're not just building America, we're building a quality product. And that's something that's really interesting to me. So not only should it be Buy America, Build America, that everyone who wants to access this funding, who wants to deploy chargers in cities from subsidies that they get from federal to state to city, they have to make sure their product is Build America, Buy America. But how do we make sure that it's actually quality? That it's going to be something that actually not only lasts, but that innovates within the domain. And that's something that I think is a real opportunity that needs to be underscored. Not just make it, but make something good and make something that lasts.
Okay, awesome. Paul, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, Alex, I'll focus on the clean vehicle tax credit in the IRA and two aspects of it. One, as a manufacturer, our vehicles, our headquarters, our factories, all out of Anaheim, California. So we're assembled in America with a global supply chain. One of the great things about the clean vehicle tax credit is the requirements around North America or US-based supply chain. That's going to make a huge difference. From the battery world, most of it's coming from Asia, and to be able to onshore or nearshore that supply chain is going to be game-changing for a variety of reasons. But for US manufacturers like us, it's going to make our supply chain so much closer, so much more reliable, and that's going to be good not only for us, but for the country from a competitive standpoint. The other aspect of it is what vehicle types are eligible for these. In a prior life, I headed up government relations for a Fortune 500 company. That's why I live in Washington, D.C. And I'm actively having those conversations on Capitol Hill and in the administration about making sure that we're not being too myopic in where these funds are going, so that form factors like GEM, which is a street legal motor vehicle, but not your typical passenger car, truck, or van, is going to have access to that. So some of these three-wheel vehicles or two-wheel vehicles, that they get access to this funding, because again, back to my earlier point, we're not going to hit these goals on any kind of timeline that people aspire to unless there's mode shift and we're attacking it from all different sectors and all different form factors. And the only way to do that, we've seen it being successful in places like Denver and other where they're incentivizing e-bikes as an example. That really moves the needle for people, and the federal government needs to step up to the table and make this funding and these benefits available to all sorts of form factors.
All right, Edward, over to you. What's the biggest federal impact on your space?
Yeah, I would say, actually, I want to hit on what Kameale was talking about earlier, too, especially within the data section of the ride-sharing community, whether that be scooters, whether that be smaller vehicles, whether that be cars, autonomous vehicles. I think what you're going to see a lot of now is a lot more codification of we're here at Curbivore. We're here about on-the-curve optimization, right? We're going to see a lot more requests and a lot more maybe perhaps invasive data requirements that really just are going to help enable the industry go further. And I see there might, there might be an evil side to that. There might be a good side to that where we can get a better understanding of what vehicles, what sizes, where they should be and where they shouldn't be, to really kind of drive that optimization at the curb. So I really think that's going to be a big thing that's going to be coming front and center for a lot of consumers, especially in my world on the insurance front. If anybody has an issue with their insurance rates today, you can certainly go to an Allstate or a Progressive and ask them to plug in the little dongle into your car. Now, I could probably see a few people already getting uncomfortable with that. I know it makes me uncomfortable. I don't necessarily want every mile I'm doing to be tracked, but we are entering into a world right now where that decision-making process is going to be much more relevant moving forward, at least on that front. But I think I want to hit on, too, the Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act. A big piece of that it's driven within this community is a huge rise in subscription models. You've got the Ford Drive model. You have, Drive Hive here locally in Los Angeles. You have Rideshare Cars, who's blessed us with a visit from Texas. You have a lot of these models now offering shorter-term subscriptions and leases, that are not really, your standard 36 to 62-month leases. We're talking maybe 24 months tops, to really drive adoption in the space. And anyone checking out an EV for the first time, I would highly recommend you take a look there as a first maybe baby steps to potentially making the change, because all these models really enabled by the Inflation Reduction Act have been able to put these vehicles out there for a much more nominal cost to get the community at large to really adopt it and move forward with it. And I think we all owe ourselves a responsibility to give it a shot where we can and enable some of these businesses to succeed with these models where they're just trying to get these cars on the road.
I want to shift the focus from what's happening in DC to what happens in individual cities, because so many of our goals, so many of our ambitions, there's obviously the direction and the funding that's set at the federal level, but really where the proverbial rubber meets the road is the city, where a mayor and a city council have a real obligation and a desire to try to make all of this movement of people and goods near the curb actually be sustainable. And so I want to touch on, I'll give you the choice of either a city you think where there's a really good example of where they're doing something well, or if you want to take it from a different angle, which is just like, look, if I could wave my magic wand, here's how I wish city councils and mayors understood and took action on the issue that makes all this movement of people and goods more sustainable. So taking it through sort of like a city lens, maybe Tiya to start with, what are the things you wish that cities were able to do or were doing to tackle some of the sustainable mobility challenges related to the curb and access?
Yeah, so interesting question. I'm going to answer it two ways. One is if I could wave my wand, I would want to make the permitting process for curbside charging go a lot faster. It's a sort of a new model in a lot of cities, and it's creating a delay in some ways, which if we could move that faster, then we can move with speed and scale. New York City, for example, wants 10,000 curbside chargers by 2030. They currently have 100. So how do we fulfill those remainder in a short period of time? But the other side, in terms of innovation in cities and greening, is sort of like best intentions, but then execution is the other side of it. So our mayor in New York City, Mayor Adams, just announced in the State of the City address last month that all rideshare drivers need to go electric by 2030. Yet only 16% of charging infrastructure is in the outer boroughs where these rideshare drivers live. So the intention is correct, but then how do we start to build the infrastructure to support the policy? And that's something that I think that needs to be addressed in line with the policy announcements, is the idea of what's the infrastructure behind it, that we don't just have sort of the empty promise and then the inability to complete that execution.
Paul, what about from your perspective as you look at GEM and trying to scale that business? What is the thing you wish mayors or city councils had on their radar screen to take care of?
Yeah, I think I'll give my hometown some props here for a variety of reasons. DC has been a leader in a global movement around lowering speed limits. If you're familiar with Vision Zero, there's lots of initiatives around trying to drive roadway fatalities to zero. The biggest one is slowing down speeds. Why? Because reaction time, impact forces, survivability, frankly, for vulnerable road users in particular. And DC took a pretty hard stand. The default speed limit in the city is 20 miles per hour. And so there are a few other exceptions to that, but if it's unmarked, that's what it is. And it really has slowed down traffic and made it safer for everyone. I ride a stand-up scooter when I'm not driving my GEM. I'm a heck of a lot safer because there's not cars going down Pennsylvania Avenue at 50 miles an hour, because between traffic lights, stop signs, traffic, and the speed limit, it really slows things down and makes it safer. So it makes a solution like GEM much more usable than it would be in other cities where the speed limit's 40 miles an hour. We couldn't operate GEM, and it's not going to be safe, to Ed's point earlier, to ride your bike or your scooter when the traffic's speeding there. The other thing I think that DC is doing well, and they're not unique in this, but they're focusing on innovation. There's a new mobility innovation district in Southwest DC where they're experimenting with lots of new electrification, sharing applications, and other ways to get electric vehicles to the community in an equitable way. And we're proud that one of the first projects they're doing, one of our largest customers, Circuit, is going to have a microtransit. The first microtransit in DC will be part of this mobility innovation district. And I think if cities approached these intertwined challenges in a creative way and let the market partner with the public sector, we're going to be really happy with what we see.
Okay. Maybe, Edward, given you already touched on some of the challenges as it relates to various vehicle form factors, but can you talk about what role cities play in either facilitating that or making that more difficult?
Totally. So that was one of the two things I was going to say as my wish list. And I really, because I see this a lot, whether it be Florida or here on the West Coast, you see very slowly but surely, the Miamis and the Santa Monicas of the world dictating the permit registration process. And they do that the same for someone with 100 scooters versus someone who has 100,000 scooters. And for me, what I would like to wave my wand and see is some sort of progressive, maybe sliding scale of responsibilities for some of these smaller operators who are essentially being put out of business by the cities that they're operating in. And they're doing that because the Limes and the Birds and the Helpizes of the world can afford all the steep prices that only keep going up. But the smaller operators, as we discussed before, the unit economics don't work out already. If I could wave my wand, it would be, okay, if you have 50 or less scooters, you obviously need to have maybe 10% of the overall bucket of responsibility than, say, an operator with 100,000 or 50,000. Let's get smarter about this. Do I think an operator with 50 scooters needs to have a $20 million limit of insurance? Absolutely not. But are we going to have to do that for our clients because the city says so? Yeah, unfortunately, in some situations, the precedents have been set, and other companies are doing it actively. So the mentality is, hey, we already have our money. We already have our contracts. If you don't want to play ball, you can go ahead and go out of business. And I wish we could fix that.
Kameale, I'd love to hear from you, actually. I'm intrigued whether you think from the ChargerHelp scaling angle and creating a reliable EV charging infrastructure, what role you think cities can play in that, in helping ensure that we reach those goals?
Yeah, I'll definitely say, just over the last 2 years or so, I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of cities and talk to a lot of local governments. And it's just been folks are overwhelmed with support for the green transition, specifically from a jobs perspective. There isn't a city that I connect with that they're just talking about the opportunity for green jobs. And so from that standpoint, that makes me really excited. But one of the things that if I could have a magic wand, right, is in order to have jobs, we do have to, consider uptime and reliability. We do have to consider, how are we supporting the businesses in our community that, may actually be deploying charging infrastructure. So there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect, because we'll still see where we'll have a hardware manufacturer that is local to that city, but maybe there's another hardware manufacturer that's more national that you'll see their stations everywhere, right? Whereas if they would use the local hardware manufacturer, they probably would have more green jobs. So that's one thing that's been very interesting. And then on the other part, to highlight a city, in California, we were able to pass the EV Charging Reliability Act. And we saw a lot of that language come out underneath Southern California Edison's policy for this last rollout of charging infrastructure. So that's been really cool to see. When things are passing at the state level, you do have, whether they're utilities or the cities that are adopting it. And we've just been very just proud of the work that specifically SCE and even NYPA, that we're seeing that they're adapting this language to understand that, like, yes, if you want green jobs, that's great, but there are other things that you need to do in order to support green jobs. Like, green jobs just won't happen without us, like, taking care of the infrastructure or thinking about how we're awarding business.
Okay, cool. I want to shift gears a little bit and just talk about the disconnect between where we are today and where we need to be in terms of making the movement of people and goods, specifically as it relates to the curb, sustainable. Like, right, there's all sorts of amazing proclamations, right? Like, this is now an era where politicians at the national, state, and federal, city level understand what's at stake and how much action is needed to change. You've got corporations making big commitments, big proclamations saying, by 2030, 2035, whatever it is, we'll be a net zero corp company or we'll sell only 100% EVs. And it's all sort of like, hey, sort of in 10, 15 years, we think we got it. But sometimes I wonder whether, like, we've really got all the pieces in place to move quickly enough to get there, or whether there will be, like, choke points along the way where you go, look, until we can scale this workforce issue, until we can figure out how to manufacture micromobility in the US, like, you name it, or the battery economy, right? We're going to have choke points potentially with China saying, hey, a lot of this battery IP, we're not going to let into the US anymore. Like, there's some risks in terms of how far we are away from some of our goals and what we're going to need to accomplish to solve those risks to actually get to, whatever it is, the either 2050 net zero or earlier as it relates to corporate and government commitments. So I guess I'd love to hear from each of you, like, what do you see as that risk point where you're like, gosh, if we can't solve for this, we're not in the next, either 2 years or 10 years, we're not going to have cities that have sustainable solutions, widely deployed, safely, and in a way that works for all their residents. Like, I would love to hear your assessment of, like, what's that bottleneck we've got to work through? Maybe Edward, start with you.
Sure, absolutely. To me, the clear-cut answer to that question is autonomous vehicles. And I ultimately see that as, right now, the leading factor. If I talk to a car share operation, whether it's 1,000 cars or 100 cars, 9 times out of 10, if they're having really bad issues with claims, with accidents, it's because of the drivers, and it's because they're not vetting the drivers well enough. And how do we ultimately fix that problem is that we develop AI strong enough to be able to actually improve over human driving behavior. And that takes time, that takes effort. I don't need to rush the process. But what I see as maybe a big impediment to that these days, and not to necessarily discount these models, but what you've seen a lot today is a rise in these remote driving sort of pseudo AI technologies. And to me, I see that as every trip, and I haven't tried it myself, so I can't necessarily speak directly to it, but for me personally, I think that takes that many miles off the road for these autonomous, because in an autonomous vehicle, that they're just doing the same route hundreds of thousands of times to study it and get better at it, and every single time they go, they're improving and learning new things. And whether you have a model that has a remote driver sitting in Arizona taking you from point A to point B, you're sort of maybe bridging the gap culturally and bringing people a degree closer because it's, someone's not in the vehicle, and maybe some folks need that for a comfortability factor, but I also see as a kind of a detriment to the industry in that we're actually removing, those trips and miles that would otherwise be studying the road and studying what we're doing, and sort of regressing and taking a step back with that. Because you look at rideshare right now, I would say we have great models like Cruise in San Francisco that's providing really cool service, autonomous ride hailing, very fun. But you look at industries that absolutely need this, which would be like standardized trucking. Right now, it's really hard to afford even the salary for a full-time truck driver, let alone the insurance, let alone the benefits. Okay, so right now the real use case we need is trucking. We need autonomous trucks to be the future, and that to be our starting point. And so to come back to your question, I think that's really the key as we move forward, is to make sure we nurture that technology and give it the space it needs to really grow and develop.
Cool. Paul, what's the choke point from your perspective?
I think it all revolves around accessibility. So we have these lofty goals but it's through a viewpoint that everyone's going to be driving around their electric Hummer or their Tesla. Well, that's not going to happen for most of society. People need to have access to lower cost vehicles that, again, meet their needs, whatever they may be. They need to have access to charging infrastructure. And unfortunately, despite all these billions of dollars, the multifamily housing communities and the folks who park on the street are going to be left behind and last in line, in my opinion. And so they have to have solutions that are brought to the table. And they also, when you talk about some of these innovative alternatives to passenger cars, people need to be able to operate them. You know, like I said, I love my stand-up scooter I ride around. My mother's not going to get on it. She needs something that's going to be very car-like and attainable. And our whole entire population is aging up, and so we need different types of things that are approachable and accessible. And it's a combination of cost, infrastructure, and form factor that need to come together. And I don't think that the plans that we have at the macro level are attacking it in a way that's going to democratize EVs.
Tiya, in your perspective, where's the choke point in getting our sustainability goals, whether they be 2030, 2050?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go earlier than 2030 and 2035. I want to go to the UN goal of 2025, which is capping all greenhouse gas emissions, especially from the sector of transport, and how, I regret this quote, but to quote Donald Rumsfeld, you want to work with the army you have. And the army that we have is the existing infrastructure that's already in cities. So we don't want to wait to build like the dream level 3 charge lots that are going to somehow be powered magically from transformers that don't even exist, that have a 19-month wait line right now to even get installed. We need to work with the infrastructure that we have. So for me, that's the pinch point, is not the ideal. The perfection is the enemy of progress in this perspective, and we want to work with everything that we have to reach that goal from what we can work with. That's already in our streets, that's already in our buildings, that's already in our cities.
All right, and Kameale?
Yeah, I like to say areas of opportunity. So the two areas that we've been focused on at ChargerHelp, one is like, how do we really understand connected devices? EV charging stations, for folks who don't know, they have to connect to a cloud, and oftentimes it's through a wireless connection. So just imagine how many times you're not able to make a phone call because you don't have all your bars. And so these charging stations, when they lack wireless connection, they don't work. And today, we haven't really had a very holistic conversation with telecom to say, as we have more connected devices, as we have more autonomous things, as we have more connected cities, how are we building things to be resilient and reliable when today it isn't, right? So that's one thing that I think is a huge area of opportunity. The other area of opportunity that we focus on a lot, like I had mentioned before, is workforce. I think that we've gotten to a space where, like, even the words workforce and equity always feel so squishy to me. It's like the words that people say, but they don't understand how hard it really is. We employ technicians all across the United States, and a bulk of my technicians are Black men. We've had a lot of Black male technicians that actually had a lot of issues on their driving records. And so we haven't been able to get them insured. But what we do know is that Black men are actually typically more pulled over than anyone else. And so how do we go about this, right? And that is the workforce. And so I think that the area of the opportunity is that these things are hard. Like, to do what we're trying to do is going to be very hard. To actually do workforce in an equitable way is going to be hard. In the same way that we put, brain power around producing revenue, we have to think about these things in that same way. Because if we just tout about training and about workforce, we're still gonna miss it. And it'll be such a shame on us if we do.
Okay, cool. I appreciate you reframing it from risk or choke point to areas of opportunity. And so I'll flip the script and actually go, we've got about 3-4 minutes left for this crew. Want to hear, as you look forward to the rest of 2023, so not long term, but just short term, what's the thing you're most excited or optimistic about where you go like, hey, either for my business or for the industry at large, as we think about trying to create more sustainable solutions as it relates to the mobility, what are the things where you go, this is making me happy and this is what really makes me excited and optimistic? Maybe Paul, start with you.
Yeah, so this is somewhat selfish, but it's also consistent with this mode shift idea, and that is using technology to enable sharing. That's something that we haven't been involved in our history, but we have lots of exciting potential partnerships that we're working on now that's going to allow you to take out a gem or the micromobility we already have from these hubs and use them as you need them, whether it's a subscription or a short-term rental, and facilitating that type of use case beyond what it already does. And we think that that's a huge growth area for us as a company, and we see a lot of societal benefits to making more of these form factors accessible on that basis.
Okay, so would it be fair to, we obviously have had for many years the notion of you owning your mobility asset, right? Owning a car. And then, of course, we had the proliferation of by the minute, pay as you go scooters. And you're sort of saying, look, one of the things that's still prime for growth is this sort of subscription in between ownership and by the minute, where you've got maybe a longer term commitment, et cetera, or something you can rely on as your sort of shared mobility solution?
Yeah, subscription is part of it, but also more point to point. So instead of free floating and chaos on the sidewalks and whatnot, have these strategically placed locations in a city where you're able to get from where you are to where you want to go in a low commitment way, but in a controlled way, so that the cities can actually grapple with this in a more sound way, and you don't have astronomical operating costs because of the chaos that ensues.
All right, Edward?
Yeah, I happen to be in the same boat as Paul. I actually think that there are a lot of variety of very cool things coming out. I think you've seen the recent launch of a flying motorbike being, probably not that soon in the future, but, fun things to look at. I actually think back to a story during COVID where I probably, like many people here, I had a pretty nasty DoorDash bill during COVID period of time. And I remember I might have gotten Five Guys or something, and I think a gentleman pulled up in a Ford F-150, and I just immediately felt extra guilty, like, oh goodness, you used this giant car to deliver me a couple hot dogs, like, oh my God. Versus the other day, I see a notification from Uber Eats that says, hey, your meal might be showing up in a electric, driverless unit, and I just was like, hey, that's awesome. That's what we want to see. We want to see these new things. Quite frankly, that might be, a more pleasant experience. I don't know, but I was really excited to see it.
Awesome. Okay, Tiya, what about you?
So what sets Itselectric apart from other EV chargers is that we power our chargers from the energy from buildings as opposed to from infrastructure. And the reason why a building, let it be a residence or a school or a library or a house of worship or a commercial storefront, would let us do this is because we revenue share back to them. So what I'm most excited about is that we're going to be starting our first pilot in New York City next month. And we're going to really start to understand data of utilization and how much money we can put back in pockets of people, so that there's a benefit of the green economy that extends to real communities, and that it's not just something that is sort of like money that is floating above everyone's heads, but that can actually be impacted and felt on a community by community basis.
All right. And Kameale, I will leave you with the parting question of the day, which is, what are you most excited or optimistic about as it relates to this near term in sustainable mobility?
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and toot my own little horn. One of the things that's been super cool is that ChargerHelp, we've seen month over month revenue growth and just like direct impact around workforce development. And to me, that is just such a strong indicator to where the industry is at. And then from a private sector perspective, we just closed our Series A, $17.5 million capital into ChargerHelp in order for us to expand on workforce development and the technology we're building around reliability. So those two things are so incredible to me, because I think that in a time where it's hard for people to raise capital, it was not hard for us to do so. And I think that we're really in a good space as an industry, to make a significant difference, and that we will be able to tap into public and private funding in order to do that. So it's really cool to me, because things cost money. I don't know if you know that, Alex, things cost money.
Things cost money, but yeah, I mean, a great point about how impressive your fundraise was in the context of a situation where a lot of venture capitalists like, ooh, I might just wait a couple months and see how things go. And, who you brought on as investors, I think, is a testament to, like, this is a time, an idea whose time has come, and is it like, right founder, right business model, right time. thank you all to all 4 of you panelists. Really great to have you with us today. So grateful that you took the time. I want to thank everybody in the audience as well. And next up, we have a panel that will start momentarily. And I believe that's Suhana from the LA Times who's going to be moderating. So thank you all very much. And I hope you stick around for the rest of the next sessions.